we're scoring about 5% in our test of what's the universe made of.
The Bible describes the real world as we know it. It has the ring of truth.
What kind of country is it that we live in when you can't tell a child why his father was killed because you didn't want him to grow up hating white people?
Does the human race deserve to continue?
From the Centre for Public Christianity, you're listening to Life and Faith. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Natasha Moore.
The story we're bringing you today runs full circle from the suburbs of Sydney to the libraries and lecture halls of Cambridge and Oxford, to a university in Tallahassee, Florida, and back to Sydney again. Sarah Irving-Stonebraker wanted to be a historian from when she was 8 years old, so that trajectory was all part of the plan. What she didn't expect was her journey from atheism to Christian faith.
On the one hand, we have written on our hearts this sense that human beings are precious and valuable, and in many ways the last few hundred years have seen enormous progress in terms of human rights, for example, which, I mean, this is another story, but which are basically grounded historically on Christian ideas and the idea that we're created equally and given rights by God. But yet, on the other hand, we are still corrupted, we're still human. And so while on the one hand we have enormous progress, we still see around the world human life being devalued everywhere. I mean, sex trafficking, human trafficking and so forth.
This is what Sarah believes now. She did become an historian. These days she's a lecturer at Western Sydney University. So the idea of what human nature is like and how it plays out over the centuries is an important one for her. But she used to be a pretty staunch atheist, so her 25-year-old self wouldn't have agreed with much of this. 25-year-old Sarah, though, was totally convinced that humans had inherent and equal moral worth. And ironically enough, it was going to hear atheist philosopher Peter Singer speak at Oxford that was really the catalyst for her to start asking some uncomfortable questions about her own atheism and about the Christian worldview.
Atheism was a label I really adopted for myself as a teenager. I grew up in a really loving but non-Christian home, and a home that really valued education. And as a teenager, I decided to label myself as an atheist. And I think the reason for that was that I didn't think that I needed God to tell me who I was or what life was all about. I had a pretty strong sense, actually, of what I knew my life was all about, a pretty strong sense of my identity and why I was here. And that was because when I was about 8, my family went on a trip to the UK. And on that trip, we saw all kinds of beautiful historical ruins, historical houses, castles, medieval towns and so forth. And I realised that the past captured my imagination. So from that point onwards, I knew that in life, what I was going to do was become a historian of the early modern world. And that became everything to me.
You knew this when you were 8?
Yeah, I did. I did. And actually I have a picture of myself and my younger brother taken outside in the University of Cambridge, taken outside the building that however many years later actually became the building where I had a room. So anyway, I had this sense that I was going to become a historian, and that's who I was. So I thought, well, if my life is about this, why do I need God? There's a kind of irony here, right, in the sense that I labelled myself as an atheist, but really when I've reflected upon it, I realised I was basically serving a God. What I mean by that is that everybody has something that they live for, right, something that gives them a sense of purpose and meaning in life. Well, for me, that's exactly what academic success was. Because I knew I had this lifelong kind of dream to become a professor of history and go to Oxford or Cambridge, or preferably both, I had to work my way to doing that. So academic success, which of course is what you need to get there, especially from Australia and if you need a scholarship, academic success became what I lived for. It gave me a sense of my identity, my sense of self-worth. Everything was wrapped up in that. That's what I lived for. And so I didn't realise it at the time. At the time, I kind of quite happily said, yes, there's no God, I'm an atheist. But actually, when you look deeper into it, and when I looked deeper into it later, I was serving a God.
So you go off to Cambridge and then eventually to Oxford. You have a strong sense of your own position in the world, your worldview, if you like. Then it got challenged, didn't it? What happened?
Yeah, well, actually, the funny thing is that this this kind of God that I served of academic success really seemed to pay off. It promised this kind of happy life and it seemed to pay off. I was really successful and managed to win all kinds of scholarships and prizes and whatever else to get into Cambridge in the first place. And I guess the first thing that happened was that when I arrived at Cambridge, I started to work on my doctoral dissertation. And the topic of my PhD was really about the earliest scientists and their role in the British Empire. Well, we call them scientists now, but the term that was used back then was natural philosophers. They studied the philosophy of nature. But the thing that struck me when I started to read all these primary sources, and these were people like Robert Boyle, who is accredited in many ways with founding modern chemistry, his friend Robert Hooke, who does a lot to kind of contribute towards the use of the microscope and the experimental method, other kind of famous philosophers like John Locke. When I started to read their sources, I realised that they had this really strong Christian faith. And now at first, when I read that, I sort of just dismissed it as a kind of tokenistic thing, dominant ideology of the time and all that. They must just be paying lip service to it. But the more I read of the archives, and we have an incredibly rich archival source in the 17th century, the more I realised that I just couldn't deny the fact that their faith was genuine. And so suddenly one of my biggest kind of assumptions about Christianity was shown to be completely false, and that was that Christianity was always going to be in conflict with modern science.
Interesting. And was that a sort of slow were thing, or were you struck by it one night reading in the library?
Yeah, it was something that kind of struck me quite over probably about the period of a few days after I'd engaged in all those sources. But one thing that kind of really made it strike me, made it hit home, was that when I read the introduction to this great work by Robert Hooke called Micrographia. It's like one of the first works that uses the microscope to explore the fossil record and talk about how life works and evolves. Robert Hooke writes in this frontispiece to the Micrographia about the fact that the microscope is intended as a scientific instrument to help repair the effects of sin on the human senses. So what that means is that in the Christian tradition, as I soon found out, the idea is that humans, created in God's image and everything is perfect, but then when the first humans, Adam and Eve, turn away from God, that moment referred to as the fall, in other words, the fall from grace. And the belief was that the fall, sin, in other words, that turning away from God, had this effect of not just kind of morally corrupting humanity, but the punishment for the fall was also cognitive in the sense that humanity's minds were not as they once were. What would have once been a kind of perfect encyclopedic knowledge of the natural world is gone, and our senses are corrupted too. So where this is relevant for Hooke is that Hooke is basically arguing that the human optical capacity, our vision, would have once been perfect before the fall, but now our vision is corrupted. And so his whole impetus, the driving force for the microscope, is this idea that, look, through the use of scientific instruments, through the use of the microscope, we can in some way, he says, repair the effects of the fall on the human mind. So this then becomes this driving force for the use of scientific instruments to look at the natural world.
So that was one kind of puzzle piece for you. Tell us about this Peter Singer thing. What happened there? And maybe that is the next piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, well, after I finished my PhD at Cambridge, this kind of idea of academic success continued to pay off, as it were. I was elected to a junior research fellowship at the University of Oxford. And a few months into my time there, my friends and I heard that very famous atheist philosopher known as Peter Singer was coming to give a series of lectures. So we're really excited, and a bunch of us went to go and hear Singer's lectures. The lectures were on the topic of ethics, in other words, do we have any kind of duties to other people? And it tapped into, more broadly speaking, it tapped into the issue of human worth. So in other words, the question of, do human lives have any value? So I quite happily went on to these lectures, really excited, because Peter Singer is a very famous philosopher, and I was expecting that as an atheist I'd be hearing exactly the kind of ethics that I subscribe to. But actually what I heard was really, it just floored me, to be honest, because the lectures that Singer was giving tapped into this issue of, do human lives have any inherent worth? And you see, because Singer doesn't believe that there's any God, then you're in a position where you've removed the ground for saying that humans are created with any kind of purpose or love, or that their lives have any inherent worth, right? Because all you're left with is looking at the natural world. What's the natural world tell us? Well, survival of the fittest, the strong eating the weak, and so forth. So on what basis can you claim then that human lives are of any inherent or indeed equal worth? And so when I left those lectures, I felt quite sick to my stomach and did quite a bit of reading and realised that Singer's very true to his atheist convictions, because he says, look, basically we're kind of left with two options if we want to think about kind of moral worth of a human life as an atheist, if you kind of remove God from the equation. And he pursues the first path, which is that, look, you basically have to come up with a list of kind of capacities that define what he calls personhood. So there are humans, of course, biological species, but then there are persons, and not every human being, for Singer, has the status of personhood. So these capacities, if you have them, give you the status of personhood, and on the basis of having those capacities that and the point is, well, why don't other creatures have rights and moral value and so forth? And of course, for Singer, they do to a greater or lesser extent. But the point is, if you have these capacities, then on the basis of those capacities, then your life has some kind of worth. So there are things like, the ability to experience complex levels of suffering, various cognitive faculties, your sort of awareness as a human being, self-awareness, self-consciousness, and so forth. But then, of course, the question is, well, what happens for those people who don't have, those human beings who don't have those capacities, the severely disabled, for example, people who are in a vegetative state, whether as a result of accident or medical treatment. The very, very young, right? Newborn babies. My 5-month-old son doesn't have the capacity to consider his sort of self-consciousness. And so elsewhere in his work, and he's quite well known for arguing this, he's arguing that, well, any kind of rights we talk about don't really apply to people who lack the status of personhood. So this has huge implications for people with disabilities, for example.
So why do you think you were so resistant to that? Like if his logic is kind of sound and you considered yourself to be an atheist, why were you so resistant to accepting that logic and going, okay, there are kind of different levels of personhood. Maybe there are. Yeah,
that's a really good question. Well, I had always basically taken it as a kind of basic, sort of moral intuition that all human beings, regardless of whether we're disabled or able-bodied, mentally or physically, are of equal moral worth. And I'd sort of just assumed that was a kind of something that, all rational people could accept. And of course, when Singer in his work says, this is the other kind of possibility, and a lot of secular philosophy proceeds down that path. But then, of course, as a historian, and actually you don't even need to be a historian to kind of think this through, you don't need much knowledge of history. Of course, all kinds of societies throughout history, and indeed in the contemporary world, don't value human life at all, right? Like even in my grandparents' generation in Nazi Germany, it was considered right, quote unquote, by that society at the time to gas to death and put in concentration camps 6 million Jewish people, right? So the notion that we have this kind of all rational people can assume that, every life is of equal moral worth, I realised is the notion that that's just something that everyone knows is really dangerously foolish as well as extremely historically ignorant.
So Peter Singer, for all his, what he has to say about disabled children and so on, he is, I think, quite a lot into like altruism and, how we should actually
ethical
care
eating,
for, doing the right thing. And obviously a lot of atheists care about leading a moral life.
Oh, absolutely. And I did too when I was an atheist. And I'm glad you asked that question, because that's the other thing that actually gave me pause for thought. I thought, well, I live an okay life. Or so I thought. And I thought, well, I have, my friends those of my friends who were atheists seem to, live pretty good lives. But then I realised that if you don't believe that there's an ultimate ground for morality, while I might have a perfectly appealing set of kind of principles that I live by most of the time, though we all kind of fall short, I realised, I might have a perfectly kind of appealing set of principles, and there are plenty of atheists who live very sort of moral lives. But that's okay as long as you're happy in saying that kind of truth is right for them, but not necessarily universally right. Because atheism does a good job of kind of explaining, people can have different moral feelings about the world, but what it couldn't explain is any kind of ultimate morality. So in other words, let's say I wanted to have a conversation with Peter Singer and said, well, hold on, Peter, look, I don't believe that that in some circumstances a very disabled newborn baby should have the right to be euthanized by its parents. I could make a really, really good argument about that and therefore be, I think, much more kind of have a more appealing morality. But then Peter Singer could make his very good argument. And then at the end of the day, all we'd have to appeal to is our argument. There'd be no kind of ultimate truth. And to put it sort of more personally, any person, that disabled child or any human being, able-bodied or not, would have no reason to be able to say, I know that objectively, ultimately, I am loved and my life is of absolute precious value. So, yeah, sorry, Natasha, to come back to your question, the idea is, or it sort of comes down to this, doesn't it, that you can have relative morality, and so, of course, relative morality can be quite appealing. I might be an atheist who, gives money to charity now and again, or I might be an atheist who lives a really good kind of moral life. But ultimately, you have no way of saying to somebody else who does the complete opposite, who lives like the Wolf of Wall Street or who lives like Adolf Hitler, I don't have anything to appeal to say, but this way of living is ultimately right. All you can come down to is say, yeah, it's right for me.
You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. Sarah Irving-Stonebraker lectures in modern European history at Western Sydney University. She started out her academic career as an atheist, but her confidence in her worldview was shaken by, of all things, going to hear atheist philosopher Peter Singer speak about morality. But that didn't mean she suddenly became a Christian overnight. Sarah continues the story.
Yeah, that basically started to spark a period of just deep reflection, because as much as I could say, oh, well, I happen to believe that every person is of equal moral worth and I have these sound morals, when I realised that, of course, that's not actually a position with integrity if you're an atheist, like if you don't believe there's an ultimate ground or an objective ground for morality, then I just have to believe, oh, well, this is good for me and it works for me, but that morality may not be shared by anyone else. But then that made me realise I can't live like this. So I went through a period, this is when I was about mid-20s, 25, 26 at Oxford, just realising that atheism could not sustain any moral belief that I had. And so it just made me engage in this period of self-reflection. And then it was during that time that I realised that sort of atheism was failing me, not only because it couldn't sustain my moral positions on the worth of human life, among other things, but also that atheism was kind of failing me on a much more personal level, to be honest. Because at that point I was 26 years old and this idea, this kind of God, lowercase g, that I realised now that I'd been serving my whole life, this idea that, look, academic success in life will bring me happiness. It had really paid off, and yet there was no deep sense of fulfilment. Like I'd achieved everything that I'd always kind of dreamed of since I was 8. I'd gotten the scholarship to Cambridge and the PhD. By that time, I had a book contract, and then my book was published and it won various awards. I had a fellowship at Oxford, like everything I could have dreamed of, and yet I was empty. So here was the world saying to me, look, your worth and your happiness in life will be produced by something that you can do. But I had everything, and I realised that it was never enough, and I kept yearning for more.
So was there a kind of catalyst? How did you decide to throw in your lot with Jesus, with these Christian people?
That was, believe me, that took a long time. That kind of period of self-reflection made me become a lot more open-minded. And, it sounds funny to say I had to become more open-minded to become a Christian, but one night in the library, I realised that the chair that I'd been, sort of like little desk that was allocated to me in the Wolfson College Library, was in front of the section on theology. And at this point, I was still too narrow-minded to go near a Bible. I was not going near a Bible. But I thought, well, hold on, if atheism doesn't work. And I turned around and there were sort of books of sermons. So I thought, okay, let's think about what is the picture of the human condition that Christianity gives me. So I opened up this book of sermons, and there was a sermon entitled, You Are Accepted. And it, among other pieces in the scripture, it pointed me to this passage from Psalm 139, which talked about God. And the psalmist who's writing the psalm is talking to God and says, "It was you, God, who formed me, fashioning me within my mother's womb." And so here was this idea that, hold on, my value as a human being and my life, my self-worth is actually given to me. It's not something that I have to work for through whatever kind of, worldly kind of success or material things or whatever. But it was given to me by God, and so my life has value because I'm created by God. And so I thought, hold on, what's this all about? And I read more, and then the more I read into that sermon, and then of course this sparked deeper reading, the more I realised that the picture that is given in the story of the Bible about who we are and who God is and what we've done wrong and who Jesus is made profound sense to me. It was a picture, in short, that said, look, the world is broken, and that was so borne out by everything I knew as a historian, looking at the poverty and the violence and the injustice in the world. And yet here we are as human beings, and this is what I could see of the human condition too, that we're yearning for something more, something that can't be captured or exhausted by this world. I mean, that's why we want poetry and art and music, and that's why we have a craving for justice. That's not our kind of yearning for justice as human beings isn't just some kind of accident of culture and biology. And the same thing, that's what I knew about my feelings about human life too. It's not just some accident of culture and biology that I happen to think that all human lives are of equal moral worth. No, this is something written into my soul, or written on my heart, as it were.
It's such a beautifully academic story in some ways, like, sitting in the library and picking up a book of sermons, and even that this was such a conscious thing for you, that you were trying to understand what the picture of humanity is. Like, was it really as kind of ordered and intellectual as all that?
Look, when
conscious?
It was, because in many ways I was always going through this internal dialogue with myself about how to make sense of the world and how to live with integrity. See, I knew that if I were to live as an atheist, I had to live with integrity as an atheist, and that would mean actually living as if my life had no ultimate meaning. But that didn't work. So in the sense that there was always this kind of ongoing dialogue with myself, a conscious exploration of like, hold on, I have to figure out what I actually believe about the world and how I'm going to live my life, then it was. But in terms of like how this actually played out over time, sometime in this period, about a year and a half after I'd been at Oxford, I got a tenure-track job at Florida State University. And once I moved to Florida, I kind of had the freedom living in America, but with no kind of family or any of my kind of existing group of friends around or anything like that. I had the freedom to kind of start being part of a Christian community. So I started eventually to kind of walk into church. And as soon as I walked into church in Tallahassee, I just had this overwhelming sense of coming home, of knowing that I was no longer running away from God. And then the more that I became part of church communities in Tallahassee, the more I started to realize that actually, in terms of like the rolling up your sleeves and doing kind of everyday life, the Christians that I saw were living life differently. They were running homeless shelters, letting homeless people sleep in the church. They were having in Florida, you have this phenomenon where there are migrant workers, undocumented migrants who do really cheap work like picking tomatoes, and they get paid very little money, right, because they're undocumented workers. So here was the church involved in their plight, bringing them in and taking their cause to the Florida government. Here they were helping people who I then discovered in the Bible, the people that Jesus is saying, look, these are my people, the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. These Christians were living life so differently, and I wanted to be part of that because it didn't seem like it was anything I'd ever seen before.
Now, tell us about the difference this made to your life, because did you suddenly become a Christian and then felt this enormous satisfaction that had been eluding you up until that point?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because the thing is, it's not one thing I think really needs to be said is that Christianity isn't some kind of self-help doctrine. Like, it's not as if like, oh, look, this is the answer to all the kind of like, you know, like it's not probiotics for the soul or something, you know. Look, I think the best way to think about this, I think, is that there are two things that went on for me. The first is, look, there was an immediate sense when I sat down in my in the closet, as it's called, sort of wardrobe, closet in American terms, in my apartment one night, and knew that now on I wanted to be part of God's family. I wanted to live for Jesus. From then on, I had an enormous burden lifted from me, and that burden had a lot to do with not thinking that I had to kind of earn my self-worth anymore, as I've mentioned, and also the fact that when I read the Bible, this passage that Jesus says, you know, come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. And I had this immediate rest for my soul, that no matter what else was going on in life, of course I still, pursuing a career and all kinds of things, that ultimately my soul had rest. Now, from then on, I think the metaphor, even that's used biblically, is that you walk through life with Jesus, and so you're always learning and growing, and you grow actually through suffering as much as through anything else. So no, that actually takes a long time, and it's never complete. So there's this kind of ongoing, walk.
So Sarah, you were already an academic, already a historian when you became a Christian, and I want to kind of ask you about how those two things interact, your faith and your history. Firstly, do they interact?
In the sense that my faith gives me a more profound understanding of everything I study in history. I mean, as a historian, one of the things that cannot but escape you is the fact that you look back into previous societies and they are full of violence and injustice and oppression and people being written out of history and glory and all the rest of it. And I think before I was a Christian, I didn't have any way of kind of making sense of what I saw in the past as the kind of, man's inhumanity to man, as it were, because obviously history is not some kind of, pure story of progress or anything like that. So I couldn't make sense of it. But now as a Christian, Christianity offers me a kind of analytical vocabulary to make sense of what I see in the past, which is, and one of the most important concepts, obviously you don't write, like history is a secular discipline, so what that means is that in my history writing, and I publish in academic journals and I publish books and so forth, I'm not talking about God, it's a secular discipline, but as a person, as a historian, the concept to me that is borne out by the past is that of sin. So what sin means is that we've turned away from God. Now, for the most part, and this is what I thought before I was a Christian, I sort of thought, sin, that means doing a list of wrongs, like a kind of list of bad stuff. And, maybe there are 7 deadly ones.
And fun stuff.
And probably like really good stuff as well. But actually, the more I began to read and increase my knowledge of the Bible, the more I realized that no, sin is a condition. It's a condition of turning towards yourself and away from God, and effectively kind of setting yourself up in God's place as the arbiter of what is right and what is wrong. And once I understood sin like that, which is, of course, sort of proper theological understanding of sin, that then enables me to understand the violence and the injustice in the past and the way that they contribute to and persist into the present. I mean, this is a turning towards ourselves and away from the good.
What's it like reading the Bible for you now? I'm interested in this because as a historian, you will know how difficult it is to get towards something real and true with time and distance. So when you read the Bible and you've kind of got a historical lens on it, what does it do for you? Are you kind of reading it going, wow, this is amazing that it holds together? Or are you skeptical reader? How does it affect you?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is that, and one of the most comforting things for me as an intellectual becoming a Christian, is that throughout the Bible, God is always telling his people, do not leave your mind and your intelligence. Don't kind of check them and leave them at the door. Come to me with your mind and intelligence and wrestle with me. Like there's a story, of course, as you know, in the Old Testament, of Jacob who wrestles with God. So God wants you, and then this is kind of echoed in other books in the Bible, for example, the Proverbs that talk about the sheer importance of knowledge and of wisdom. So God wanted me to use my intelligence and use my knowledge to pursue him.
There's a sense in which, Christianity in particular is kind of a religion of history, in that it really hinges on, this particular person, these particular events that it claims happened at this time in history and in this place in the first century. Was it kind of important for you as an historian and considering the claims of Christianity to weigh up that history and go, can I trust the history?
Yeah, it was. And because of that, I, again, like as the Bible tells me to do, I want to bring my knowledge and my inquiring mind to all of this. And so I did a lot of reading, and there's a ton of books out there that deal with the story of who Jesus of Nazareth is and what it comes down to, which is, look, did he die upon a cross? And as we know, all the historians, even atheist historians of the ancient world, by the consensus is that, yes, he died on that cross. It was executed by the Romans. And so the question is, look, did he rise 3 days later? And there are enormous, I'm not a historian of the ancient world, but yeah, I looked into and read about all the texts and the enormous historical weight of sources behind the resurrection, the fact that Jesus appeared in his body 3 days later and then appeared to all these witnesses.
If someone wants to kind of look into those questions of can I trust Christianity, what would you tell them to do? Where should they start?
Do it. I think one of the best places to start is there's a book called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. And it's actually partly a story, and I think it's been made into a movie, but the book, I have to say there's a book, right, because I'm a historian.
Academic, yeah.
But there's a great book called The Case for Christ, and there are edited books too. Lee Strobel and William Lane Craig are two authors who do a really good job of bringing together the historical evidence for Christ and writing about it. And of course, always anticipating potential arguments against the historical case, which is what Lee Strobel does in that book as well.
You've been listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Natasha Moore.
Sarah Irving-Stonebraker is an historian at Western Sydney University. Her story is one of many you can listen to or watch on our website, publicchristianity.org. Make sure you subscribe to Life and Faith if you haven't already. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, do leave us a rating or review.
If you're wanting to investigate further some of the things Sarah was talking about, the authors she mentioned at the end were Lee Strobel and William Lane Craig. Both have multiple books you can get hold of, or YouTube videos you can watch. And you can watch our interviews with William Lane Craig as well. We spoke to him a few years back when he was in Sydney. Those are available on the CPX website too. Next week on Life and Faith.
It's relatively easy, we think, to measure physical health outcomes. It's now possible to measure some emotional outcomes. People like to think that they can measure spiritual outcomes. I have grave concerns about that. I'm not sure that it's the kind of thing that can be measured. And I think it's very important that we never think that only the things that can be measured count. We often think if it can't be counted, then it doesn't count. That's just wrong. Most of the things that matter most to us, in fact, are things that can't be counted or measured. Things like love and relationships and a sense that our life has made some kind of contribution to the world, that it's been a valuable thing all in all.